Good evening viewers, welcome back to my channel Literati. Today I will analyze Ted Hughes and his poem Chaucer. Ted Hughes, undoubtedly one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, his name was Edward James Hughes. He was born on the 17th August 1930. He died on 28th October 1998. Ted Hughes is a formidable name in English literature, particularly the postmodern era. Another fact which is very prominent about him and which is very well known is that he was married to Sylvia Plath, who sadly committed suicide in 1963. Ted Hughes was very versatile. He is a translator, an editor, a children's book author, as well as a great poet. He was Poet Laureate of England from 1984 to 1998. There are several collections of poems and he has written books as well. Some of the famous collections are The Hawk in the Rain, which incidentally Sylvia Plath edited, and they were married at that time, a marriage which sadly ended in separation. 1960 Lupercal, and 1962 selected poems which he wrote in collaboration with Thomas Gunn and which marks a new kind of expression in postmodern English poetry. In 1967, his collection Vaudois was published. 1970, Crow, which is a collection of poems, came out. And then, of course, he wrote and translated many other works. In his personal life, he was a very outdoors kind of a person. He loved hunting, fishing. He had worked in London Zoo, so there is a lot of animal imagery in his poems. He was very interested and he had observed the behavior of the animals, which he presents, adding his own perspective and adding a new dimension to the animals which he has had a chance to observe very minutely in his work at the London Zoo. Ted Hughes, along with Philip Larkin and Thomas Gunn, belong to a group of poets who are known as the postmodernists. They belong to the postmodern era of English literature. What exactly does this period cover? We know that modern age in English literature, it begins from the early 20th century and it marks a complete break from the kind of literature which had gone on or which was written or which was expressed in the Victorian age and the late Victorian age, the 19th century. It is a revolutionary kind of expression which comes in the modern age, in poetry, in drama, in fiction, and it established new trends and which completely signified a break between the old and the new. Postmodernism covers, or it comes after the modern age. We can consider the postmodern age to begin after the World Wars, and particularly from the 1960s till the present. What exactly are the characteristics of postmodernism? We know that modernism is, like I said just now, it is a completely revolutionary and a new concept which came in literature, also in painting, also in architecture, and the way of dressing, everything which defied what was traditional and which had gone on before. Postmodern literature, it is a continuation of the same spirit, but of course there are certain differences. Certain ideas or certain concepts which postmodern expression is based on are what is known as intertextuality. This poem Chaucer itself is a very good example of that, where the different texts are presented together and they combine together to create an effect. As this poem Chaucer tells us, it is a poem of Chaucer, that great 14th century literary figure who is also considered the father of English literature. Ted Hughes had admired Chaucer a lot, and he had said once, quotation, "One poet I have read more than any of these is Chaucer." He was referring to other poets. And he finds him very inspiring and he admires him a lot. Let us look at the trends in postmodern poetry. One is intertextuality, which I explained right now, mingling of the ancient and the futuristic. That is, there's a complete fluidity or no boundaries of time. It is a combination of everything which we have seen in the wasteland also, because all literature is a continuing tradition, as T.S. Eliot has explained in his critical essay, Tradition and Individual Talent. So there are no boundaries. There are boundaries of themes, it can move easily between the ancient and the futuristic and the present. There is a fluidity of meanings. It does not and it has completely flexible meanings. It can be interpreted in several ways. It does not move in a single direction. These are the concepts which are present in modern literature as well. And the modern literature was a complete break from the traditional ways of writing. Some of the very revolutionary concepts of modern literature were absurdism, a non-linear narrative, a stream of consciousness technique, blended images, and the influence of the images. All these characteristics are present in the wasteland, and the wasteland is considered, or it can be taken as a perfect example of what modern literature was. It exhibits all the trends. It exhibits absurdism, non-linear narrative, intertextuality, and of course the blended images, one kind of image blending into another, and the influence of the images. This is where the postmodern literature or postmodern poetry differs from modern poetry, because it moves in a different direction. There are similarities. It is born out of modern literature or modern poetry, but then it has also carved out a different direction. Modern poetry, particularly when we have read Sylvia Plath, and when we read Ted Hughes, and we read Philip Larkin, we find that their expressions or their lines or the construction of the poem is not disjointed. It is not fragmented. It is, many times, it is a very conventional form, as we have seen in Sylvia Plath's Daddy. She expresses a deep disturbance and a kind of conflict, which is a part of her existential angst. And she tries to find a sense of closure. But the construction of the poem is very conventional. It is in equal and perfectly composed stanzas. There is no sense of disjointedness or broken lines or kind of fragmentary expression. It is expressed in a very clear and a very concise manner. Similarly with Philip Larkin and Ted Hughes. It is not. So this is one very stark difference. And modern poetry as well as postmodern poetry is very, very subjective. But the difference is, in the modern poetry, there is a attempt to find a solution, as we have seen in The Wasteland, where the poet takes on the role of leading the readers through a wasteland, ultimately to a search or to a point where the poet can exhibit or the poet can express the possibility of a solution. In the postmodern era, the postmodern literature, the poet does not take on this role. The poet deals with his or her own problems in his or her own way. They express their personal truth, which is not perfect. They're not looking for perfection. They're not looking to create a perfect world. They are, unlike the other poets, unlike, let us say, for the Romantics, they do not have any philosophy of life to express. They are just stating their own personal experience, their own personal truth. They are not trying to, or they're not expressing a truth which may be universal to all. Cecil D. Lewis, a famous poet, he says, quotation, "Post-war poetry was born among ruins." This is true of The Wasteland, of course, which was written in 1922, immediately in the aftermath of World War I. This becomes particularly pronounced in the decades after World War II. And this is the trend, or this is the style, or this is the concept of postmodern poetry, English poetry. And each poet is trying to present his or her own truth. So modernism and postmodernism both go together. They can be read in light of each other. Postmodernism takes us one step further, or it deviates in a different direction. It has its own beliefs. One thing which is very striking about postmodern poetry is and even fiction, is the multiplicity of the themes. There are so many different themes which can be explored, but they are not explored with a sense of doom or with a sense of fatality or an existential disappointment. Rather, you find, or we find, the readers find, that there is an element of dark humor and even playfulness. This playfulness is very apparent in Philip Larkin. It is very apparent in poets like Ogden Nash, who create a kind of magic realism and who also deal with these subjects in a very, very playful manner. Sort of, they do not make it sound too heavy, but they employ a kind of dark humor and a playful manner. Ted Hughes in Chaucer, he talks about the poet Chaucer, obviously. This particular poem was printed on January 8, 1995, and 16 January 1995 printed in New Yorker, and it is obviously a poem which again defines some of the concepts or some of the styles of postmodern poetry. But then there is a complete fluidity of themes. There is no universal philosophy or no universal truth which these poets are trying to express. They are expressing their own personal truth, and they try to look at it almost half playfully, particularly Philip Larkin and poets like Ogden Nash. Quotation from Wikipedia, which defines postmodernism. quotation, postmodern literature celebrated the meaninglessness of the world and embraced the obscure and the nonsensical. Full stop. It blurred the line between reality and fiction and had fun doing it. Quotation. So you see, the difference is that the intensity or the disturbing quality which was present in, again, let us take the example of Wasteland or the drama of that particular period, which exhibited the emotional, physical, and spiritual crisis of the modern day world, is not really exhibited or not really present in postmodern literature. They deal with it, but in a non-serious way, in almost a playful manner. Like I said, it is very much present in Philip Larkin and poets like Ogden Nash, who have turned the themes on their head and sort of created it or treated it in a playful manner. Just before reading Chaucer, I'll read to clarify my point. I will read Days by Philip Larkin. What are days for? Days are where we live. They come, they wake us, time and time over. They are too happy to be in. Where can we live but days? Solving that question brings the priest and the doctor in their long coats running over the fields. So, half playfully, sarcastically, ironically, they do present the truth of life, but they do not make it heavy, they do not make it too intense, they do not make it very, very disturbing. And again, repeating myself, I will mention Ogden Nash and Roald Dahl, both of these poets who have written what are known as limericks or doggerels even, but then they have been able to present a very concise truth and make a very potent statement. But then, like I said, the postmodern poets and writers are not portraying an universal truth or universal philosophy. They are just exhibiting their own or expressing their own personal truth, their own attitudes, their own subjective perception of reality, and they don't expect it to be an universal perception. So what does this poem Chaucer tell us? Chaucer is the first great English literary figure, known for his Canterbury Tales. He was the great poet who explored or who exhibited the possibilities of the English language in the 14th century. Chaucer was a realist. Chaucer was a secular person, very modern in his outlook, though he belonged to the medieval age. He rescued English literature from the realm of allegorical and religious figures to real-life characters. His prologue reads like a portrait of characters which have immortality because they present the essential truth of humanity. And Chaucer, with his great sense of humor, with his tolerant attitude, with his ability to look at people without judging them, was truly a Renaissance man in spirit, because it's very different from the times in which he lived. That was in the 14th century. And for all these characteristics or for all these attributes, Chaucer is known, or he is considered the father of English literature. And Ted Hughes himself says that he admired him a lot. Many analysis of this poem Chaucer. Another thing about the composition of the poem is that it reads like what is known as prose poetry. One line moves on to several lines and then comes to an end. It is in 41 lines. And of course, the movement is very poetic, but the lines are long and it has almost the quality of a prose-like verse. The verse, that is the lines or the poetic composition, reads almost like a prose. Many analyses of this particular poem have expressed the fact that Chaucer is being defended against the critics by Ted Hughes, who compares the critics to the cows who come lumbering over the field. Look at or listen to the sound of Chaucer being recited. They seem interested, but only briefly. Soon their attention wanders off. They leave placidly without Chaucer having made much impression on them. This poem, again, because of the multiplicity of the themes or the fluidity of meanings, which is the characteristic of postmodern poetry, can be read on many levels. This seems to me as if Ted Hughes is, of course, being sarcastic, but what he intends to present in this poem is that the sublime meaning, the deep meaning, the insights, the character analysis, Chaucer's deep humanity, his realism, his ability to understand people and life is lost on most people who are like cows. They just read him out of curiosity. They read him because he's supposed to be read. They read him because he's a famous name. But they are unable to, or they're immune to the magic and the beauty of the poetry of Chaucer. Just like the cows, for the cows, the sound of Chaucer being recited in a field would be just a sound of words. Similarly to these people who are not perceptive or who simply do not have the ability, they simply don't have the sensibility to understand the loveliness of Chaucer, they are like these cows. The poem opens with a quotation of two lines, the opening lines of Chaucer's prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Wan that April with his shower suit, the drought of March hath burst to the root. These are the two immortal lines with which that great prologue opens. Those lines which are perfect in expression, full of sly humor, sarcasm, irony, and satire, very correct observation on human nature, potent because it is so mild and so beautifully expressed, which has Chaucer saying to his readers that people want to go out of doors when it is the month of April and the season is beautiful, the climate is perfect, the sun is shining. April has transformed the world, which is emerging out of the long, dark, dreary winter months, and the world looks beautiful once again. The sweet showers of April have erased or removed the dryness of March, and the world is full of life and an air of beauty and energy and revival. At the top of your voice, where you swayed on the top of a stile, your arms raised somewhat for balance, somewhat to hold the reins of straining attention of your imagined audience, you declaimed Chaucer to a field of cows. Full stop. This is the first line which runs on in several lines. And Ted Hughes, the poet, says that you, and it is rather comically, it is said with a dark humor, with sarcasm, that you try to declaim Chaucer, to read Chaucer, to recite from Chaucer at the top of your voice. You imagine that you were declaiming it or proclaiming it to an audience who was very interested in an open field on the top of a stile, and to balance yourself to appear at an elevated level. This elevation might be an indirect reference to the elevation of mind, which is lacking in those who do not understand Chaucer or those who criticize him. And all you find, your audience in that open field was no one but a herd of cows. And the spring sky had done it with the flying laundry and the new emerald of the thorns, the hawthorn and the blackthorn, and one of those bumpers of champagne you snatched unpredictably from pure spirit. Champagne is a wine which is heady, which is intoxicating, which is beautiful, which is supposed to be perfect. And the spring sky is like the sky which Chaucer had described in his Canterbury Tales. It is beautiful, it is blue, it is the world is full of a mild breeze which brings scents of flowers and the birds and the bees, as Chaucer had described in his prologue, and which creates a feeling of restlessness and a feeling of amorousness in the people who want to move out of doors and enjoy themselves. Now, the same spring sky is present, but the reality is mundane. The reality is the flapping laundry in the wind on the clothesline. And this reality seems to contrast with the headiness which Chaucer can give you, like it gave to Ted Hughes. He got drunk on Chaucer. He admired Chaucer so much. For him, Chaucer was the ultimate in poetry. And of course, Chaucer's greatness cannot be questioned. So he compares that headiness which he can feel to champagne, to an intoxicating feeling of drinking champagne which you snatched, that is, which he could see, read, enjoy, and feel in Chaucer's poetry. But most of the people are blind to its beauty. That is what he feels angry about. Your voice went all over the fields towards Grantchester. It must have sounded lost. But the cows washed, then approached. They appreciated Chaucer. And then Ted Hughes says that as you go on reciting Chaucer to an imaginary audience, there's nobody to listen except the cows. Your voice was carried over the wind towards Grantchester. Grantchester is a beautiful village in England, and incidentally, it was a home to Rupert Brooke, the great war poet. It was also a cultural hub in the early 1900s of a group of literary figures known as the Bloomsbury Men. And so the reference to Grantchester is deliberate to create that literary allusion. And then Ted Hughes says, your voice was lost in the winds, but the cows were interested. The cows came and they watched, they approached, they appreciated Chaucer. And he says, maybe they was attracted by the sound of my voice, but they at least came. And maybe the cows had the sense to appreciate Chaucer. Here he again makes a very pointed innuendo and a pointed remark and a pointed sarcastic criticism of those people who pretend to understand Chaucer, but actually they do not. They are worse than these cows. You went on and on. Here were reasons to recite Chaucer. Then came the wife of Bath, your favorite character in all literature. You were rapt, and the cows were enthralled. And then the poet says, you went on and on. You were so carried away. And Chaucer always captivated you so much that you could not stop. You went on reciting lines from memory. And then you came to that immortal character, the wife of Bath, which is, of course, one of the most memorable characters in the prologue. She is a woman who is seems like real flesh and blood woman, not a caricature. That was another great contribution of Chaucer, that he created men and women of flesh and blood and not allegorical cardboard characters, which was again something new which he created in the medieval age. The wife of Bath is a lewd, loud, vulgar woman in the procession of the pilgrims who are going to Canterbury. And she is unapologetic about her escapades, her sexual escapades. She lives lives on her own terms. She is wealthy. She makes her own rules. And she is a woman who is obviously a person who has large appetites. She's a large woman. She is a woman who has had several husbands. She's amorous. She is someone who is unforgettable. And then here Ted Hughes seems to make another dig at the people or the critics. And he says that you're only interested when someone like the wife of Bath is being discussed or she's being described by Chaucer. She seems to capture your attention because you're interested only in this kind of titillation or this kind of cheap thrill. You were rapt, and the cows were enthralled. They shoved and jostled shoulders, making a ring to gaze into your face, with occasional snorts of exclamation, renewed their astounded attention, ears engaging to catch every inflection, keeping their odd 6 feet of reference away from you. You just could not believe it, and you could not stop. What would happen if you were to stop? Would they attack you, scared by the shock of silence or wanting more? And the poet says that it seemed that the cows were hanging on to every word. Their attention was riveting. It was amazing. It was even frightening. And the poet said, I dare not stop because they seemed to hang on to every word. They were so enchanted, enthralled, interested in the description of the wife of Bath. Again, meaning that anything which is vulgar, anything which is cheap, anything which is sexual, automatically draws people. And they seem to understand such things better than the other fine nuances of fine characters. It seems that the earthy wife of Bath seems to them more interesting than anyone else. And the cows is a reference to the people or the critics or anyone who does not care about Chaucer or does not appreciate Chaucer. And the poet says that you dare not stop, I dare not stop. I went on and on. I could not know if my stopping would create a commotion among the cows. I was afraid. I thought that it might result in some kind of a disturbance if I stopped. So you had to go on. You went on, and 20 cows stayed with you, hypnotized. How did you stop? I can't remember you stopping. I imagine they reeled away, rolling eyes as if driven from their fodder. And he says, I went on and on, but obviously their attention flagged. They were not anymore interested when there was no other lewd character like the wife of Bath, no other vulgar characterizations or exhibitions of traits of character or anything refined did not interest them. And so they distanced themselves. Did not stop, but my narration no longer had their interest, and they rolled their eyes as if in exasperation, as if in boredom, and they thought of other things like their fodder. I imagine I shooed them away, but your sostenuto, rendering of Chaucer, sostenuto is a word which Ted Hughes has coined. He often uses such difficult words, and he likes to coin these words. Rendering of Chaucer was already perpetual. What followed found my attention too full and had to go back into oblivion. And so your rendering of Chaucer was perpetual. It seemed to come from deep within your heart, but your only audience was the cows, whose attention was momentary, only drawn towards you when the wife of Bath was analyzed with all her quirks of character and her lusty demeanor and her behavior and her loud personality. But other people or other characters in Chaucer seemed colorless to them, did not interest them, so the cows went away. Here, like the postmodern poetry, in keeping with the multiplicity of meanings and in creating a kind of subjective truth, the cows can be the general people who do not have the imagination or the interest or the perception or the sensibility to understand or appreciate Chaucer, or the cows might be might be those people who question Chaucer or who are critics. The popular definition of this poem goes that Ted Hughes is actually criticizing the critics, or he's satirizing them and their attitudes. And it can also be read as the general lack of interest among people who do not have any deep interest in literature, who have very superficial interests, who do not really understand anything which has a serious note. And as this poem reads, or it has a construction which has almost a prose-like quality, but of course the movement is very poetic. Ted Hughes himself has a very deep interest in animal imagery, and he has exhibited or represented the cows as the pedestrian cows as representing the mundanity or the ordinariness or the lack of imagination, the plebeian quality, the pedestrian quality of general people. Now, Ted Hughes is, of course, a postmodern poet. He is a poet who is among the best in the postmodern era, and he has the influences on him have been several. He is influenced by Carl Jung, Robert Graves, W.B. Yeats, Hopkins. His own wife Sylvia Plath was a great poet, and no doubt they had a creative interaction as well, though their marriage ended soon and it did not last. Another poem which Ted Hughes or exhibits Ted Hughes's interest in animals and his hunting and fishing is the poem Pike, where there is a very detailed description of a fish as some kind of a prehistorical animal. Now, when we read postmodern literature, like I said, there are similarities, but they are a kind of, it is a kind of movement which is away from modern literature. Like in modern literature, we have a lot of flagrant shifts of narrative. Let us take the example of The Wasteland once again, where we hear so many different voices. Sometimes it is the voice of the poet, sometimes it is the voice of a woman, sometimes it is the voice of a figure from mythology like Tiresias, and so on. So there are flagrant shifts in narrative and jumps in time, and but that is not so in postmodern poetry. Postmodern poetry is subjective. All modern literature is subjective, and it portrays a subjective truth as well. Now, there is a definition of postmodern literature which is actually applies to fiction, but we can see it in the context of postmodern poetry as well. And I'll just read this out to you. This quotation is by John Booth. He was John Barth. He was a writer himself, and he's written two essays. One is The Literature of Exhaustion, which came out in 1967. The second one, which he elaborated on the ideas which he had presented in The Literature of Exhaustion, is The Literature of Replenishment, which came out in 1980. He has said certain things about postmodern literature, which is about fiction, but which we can apply to poetry as well. Quotation: "My ideal postmodernist author neither merely repudiates nor merely imitates either his 20th century modernist parents or his 19th century pre-modernist grandparents. He has the first half of the century under his belt, but not on his back, without lapsing into moral or artistic shoddy craftsmanship, modern Madison Avenue venality, or either false or real naivete." So he says that the postmodernist writer does have affinities with the modern writers and, of course, with the era before him, the Victorian age. He calls them parents and grandparents. But he is influenced, but he does not carry them on his back. That means there is no overload. He finds his own truth, he finds his own meaning. And that is very apparent in their ideals which they follow, and their doing away with any kind of fragmentary construction in their poems. All the poems which we read, we have a very easy construction. They are not looking to offer any solutions like The Wasteland does. They are presenting their own subjective truth, which is not a perfect truth, but then that is the reality. There is the element of intertextuality, but that had come in with the modernist poetry also. There is a sense of magic realism. There is a turning of the mixing of the ancient, modern, and futuristic. There is a fluidity of meanings. There is no fluidity of narrators as it is in The Wasteland. As we have read Sylvia Plath, we have read Ted Hughes' Chaucer, we find that there is a single narrator from the beginning till the end, and usually it is the voice of the poet himself or herself. So Ted Hughes, one of the finest names, presents all the best qualities of postmodernist poetry is in his work, as do Sylvia Plath and Philip Larkin. Postmodernism is one step or a movement which originates from modernism, which is exhibited in not only in literature but also in art, in fashion, in architecture, in music, in painting, in architecture, which shows such trends as surrealism, Dadaism, and many other trends. The poems of Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath and Philip Larkin, they keep us firmly in reality, and even the most intense themes are dealt with a sense of dark humor, as we have seen in this poem, and also with a playfulness, deliberate playfulness, visible in the poems of Philip Larkin, Ogden Nash, and Roald Dahl. Thank you.